Everyone, mahalo and aloha. So this word aloha, I learn a little bit about it every time I come to Hawaii. It's not just hello and goodbye, but it's also a connection, right? Connection with our family, connection with our communities, connections with the place that we live. And so I wanted to thank all of you for being here these few days, leaving some of your connections, your family members, your spouses, loved ones, communities, organizations to be with us. And I'm also going to talk a little bit today about something that I think forms a connection between us and Hawaii. So, when I say Alaska, what do you think of? Snow, cold, other words? Big. Grizzly bears, big, okay. Yep, global warming, these are things as well. It's true, so we have all of those things, but what I wanted to talk about a little bit also is a word that I didn't hear you all mention, and that is this idea of an island. So, fair enough. These palm trees in the top left of your screen are not real palm trees. They're made from driftwood and baleen in Barrow, Alaska. But in many ways, Alaska really is an island. We have the southern part of the state is 500 miles from our next closest state. The major population center, which is Anchorage, is 4 times that distance, 2,000 miles from our next closest state. We have an amazing amount of coastline. So more coastline in Alaska than in the rest of the US combined. And that includes some 34,000 miles of marshlands in Alaska. We also have more than 200 islanded microgrids in Alaska, teeny communities that are running small-scale grids that are totally self-sufficient and not connected to any larger grid. And the state is massive, right? If you cut the state in half, the 3rd largest state in the country would be Texas, which we like to remind them about, any chance we get. And yet there's a myth about Alaska that our geography or our vastness or our distance from other places is a hindrance to innovation entrepreneurship. And I want to push back. I don't believe that that's the truth. I think that it is that very vastness, our kind of island style in Alaska, that makes us a great place for innovation. Because if you're a startup that wants to solve a problem in food, water, transportation, or energy, I can pretty much guarantee you that in Alaska, we have a need for the solution that you're developing. To illustrate that need, I want to talk about just an anecdote from last year. I went into our local grocery store, Fred Meyer, and walked in, and the produce aisle was entirely bare. And I noticed that there was a note that someone had posted on the aisle that said, a truck had overturned 1 day prior, and for that reason, our produce aisle was bare. Think about that, a single day, and all of a sudden, we don't have access to the produce that we need. And this is a reality of living in Alaska. We're well aware that at any given time, we're one port closure, one grid failure, one earthquake away from some really interesting times. And that's true no matter where you live in the state. Today, Anchorage, which is the largest population center, is a thriving metropolis with all of the kind of amenities you'd expect from other cities. And yet even there, folks know that we have this very intimate relationship with the outdoors. We're surrounded on all sides by thousands of miles of rushing waves and frozen tundra and just untrammeled wilderness. So what does a technology need to do in a place like Alaska? What are the features that we need in a place like that? Well, I would say there are 3 things. One is that for a technology to work in Alaska, it needs to work all the time. 2, it needs to be really hard to break. And 3, if it does break, it needs to be easy to fix. So that's true of these snow goggles these UPIC snow goggles from the community of St. Lawrence Island, which is out in the Bering Sea. Amazing thing, these are made out of walrus tusk, and they have a wide field of view, and they reduce glare off of snow and ice and water. And I was astonished the first time that I tried some of these on, they also improve visual acuity, which is like the clarity over distance. This technology and the kind of design thinking behind this technology is as relevant for the last 2,000 years as it is today. Things that need to work, to be really hard to break, and to be easy to fix if they do break. And now we are applying that same logic to things like microgrids and drones and ways of producing and consuming resources in water, transportation, food, and energy. And so I have to give a shout out here to the Elemental team in Hawaii. If you recognize these 4 areas, they'll look familiar to you. The folks at Elemental Accelerator have been great partners of ours, and we're kind of the inspiration and model for what we've set up in Hawaii. We think of ourselves in some ways as kind of an Arctic version of Elemental. And so hats off to that team. They've been incredible. We're focused on food, water, transportation, and energy, these 4 resource areas. And as those of you in this room know, those 4 areas are really interconnected. So if you're trying to solve a problem in one, say energy, you oftentimes end up solving problems in the other 3, and vice versa. To give you an example of that, take Alaska's seafood industry. So this is a huge industry. It generates some $14 billion in economic value for the country. It's 20% of our state's output, economic output. Salmon, which is the largest species within the seafood that we export, is an interesting species because it only comes in really in numbers for a few months a year. So think of that. In order to get that salmon from the sea onto someone's plate in another part of the world, you have to basically scale up an entire industry to harvest and process and ship out that fish within just a very small amount of time. How do you create energy systems for those seafood processors? How do you manage the logistics of this industry? How do you kind of build this system that sets up for just a few months a year and then really comes down for for the rest of the year? Well, it would sure be nice if we're trying to kind of decarbonize and electrify that seafood industry if there was a energy resource that happened to be where the fish are, right? So lo and behold, this is just one of the anecdotes from Alaska. The offshore wind resource in Alaska is pretty tremendous. In fact, NREL did a study just a couple years back that showed that the offshore wind resource in Alaska is 70% greater than the rest of the US combined. Great wind resource. So how do you take that amazing wind resource and use it to solve problems in food and energy within the whole seafood market? There's a really interesting group that has kind of figured this out in a really compelling way. So the island of Kodiak, which happens to be the 2nd biggest island in the country behind Hawaii's Big Island, back in 2002, they set a goal of going 95% renewable by 2020. At the time, this is before the cost curves on solar and storage that you're also familiar with had happened. Yet they set this very ambitious goal, and lo and behold, they achieved that goal 6 years early. So by 2014, they had already arrived at that goal, and they've now far surpassed it. And the interesting thing about this is that a community got organized, they set a goal, and then corporates and innovators from throughout the world arrived to help them with that goal. And I think that's an exciting role for Alaska that is beginning to happen more and more, where we have problems that are relevant to global markets and communities throughout the planet. And Alaska is a great place for folks to test those technologies, prove out their business models, and then go to other places to deploy them even further. And it's not just big corporates and large organizations. One of our homegrown startups is 60 Hertz, and this group has created an app that allows rural utility operators to monitor the maintenance and the operations of those rural utilities. And this app now is being used in more than 10 communities in Alaska and has applications for not just electric utilities, but also water utilities as well. And the reason this matters is because it is solving a real problem in a place where it has to work all the time, and they're working with their local partners and community members to make this thing work. So what I would ask you today is when you think of Alaska in the future, don't just think about ice and grizzly bears and some of those other things. Think of it as a place that is accelerating the resource revolution. Thanks so much.